Before I continue with my videos on note reading, I want to take a bit of a detour to talk about rhythm. In my opinion, the notation system for rhythm is actually a bit simpler than it is for notes, but in practice I found that many students struggle more with rhythm. So although I will be explaining some of the symbols used to read and write, I'll be focusing more on how to learn rhythm than on the notation itself. I use these same strategies for everything from the most basic to the most complex rhythms, so hopefully there's something here for all levels. If you're a beginner, I'd recommend watching the video from the start, but if you're an intermediate or advanced musician, you might want to skip ahead to the chapter titled Solve It Like a Math Problem, using the timestamps in the description. Let's start by taking an in-depth look at these two simple rhythms. If I play and count the top example, it might sound like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Even if you're a complete beginner to reading rhythm, you may be able to follow along just because of how the notes are laid out on the page. Notice how the first note is given a little more space and the next two are clumped closer together. When I play this rhythm, I hold the first note longer and then move more quickly through the next two. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. My counting stays the same speed, but I count once for the quarter notes and twice for the half notes. In the bottom example, the first note gets even more space, and the second note is just barely squished in before the bar line. So as you might expect, the first note gets held even longer this time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. This one's called a dotted half note. The dot means to hold the note half again as long. So if a half note normally gets 2 counts, the dotted half note gets half again as many for a total of 3. In my opinion, the single hardest thing about reading piano music is the sheer volume of information we have to deal with in order to know what to do. So if I can just glance at a rhythm and already have a pretty good idea of which notes are going to be longer and shorter, that frees up some brain power that I can use to think about other things, like notes. I'll talk a lot more about this later in the video. Especially when I'm sight reading, I'm often most tuned in to the visual layout of the rhythms on the page, as this is one of the fastest ways to process the information. However, this approach has a major drawback, which is that it's not very precise. In the bottom example, a quick glance will tell me that the first note is longer than the second note, but I have to look closer to work out how much longer. The more complex the rhythm, the more likely it is that I'll make a mistake if I'm using only this method. For a foolproof way to guarantee that my rhythm is accurate, I like to think of solving it like it's a math problem. This is a more detailed approach, which means it's also going to be slower, but with practice it can become pretty quick. When I'm using this strategy, it's important that I look at every symbol involved in the rhythm. There's one detail in both of these examples that I haven't mentioned yet, the time signature. You can think of the time signature like the answer key to the math problem. The top number tells us how many beats, or counts, everything should add up to, and the bottom number tells us what type of note gets the beat. In 4/4 time, the top number tells me to count to 4, and the bottom number tells me that a 1/4 note, or a quarter note, gets 1 count. Now that I have the answer key to solve the rhythm in the top example, I have to make sure everything's adding up to 4 beats. I know the half note is supposed to get 2 beats, so I'm going to count it 1, 2. Next up, I'll say 3 when I play the first quarter note, and that leaves 4 for the second quarter note. The bar line tells me to start my counting over again from 1, so I'd count the rest of the notes the exact same way. If you're struggling with a rhythm, you could try writing in the counts on your music just like this. When I start playing with both hands together, reading the rhythms becomes a bit more complicated. Glancing at the visual layout, I might notice that the quarter notes here are all spaced about equally from left to right, so it shouldn't be a surprise that I'm going to play one note on every count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. But the solve it like a math problem approach reminds me to pay attention to all of the symbols, not just the most obvious ones. Here, there's some new notation. This is called a quarter rest, and it means to rest, or not play, for 1 count. In this example, there are really 3 math problems to solve. One is the rhythm of the right hand, which goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. The second is the rhythm of the left hand, which goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. The final rhythm is the composite rhythm, which is what we get when we add both of the other rhythms together. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. In this case, the composite rhythm is a lot simpler than the two individual parts, which is actually pretty common. But if I only focus on the composite rhythm, I don't quite get the full picture. To really understand what's going on here, I have to solve all three math problems. It's a little bit more work, but it means I'm going to know the rhythm a lot better in the long run. Understanding the rhythm correctly is an important step to playing it correctly, but it's not the only factor. If I saw this example while sight reading, my first instinct would probably be to panic. After that, a quick visual scan might tell me that the right-hand notes are clumped together at the beginning of the bar, and that the left-hand note is the last note before the bar line. If I look a little closer, I might notice the time signature telling me that there should be 4 beats in every bar. The right-hand notes come at the beginning, so they're going to fall on beats 1 and 2. Meanwhile, the left hand has a half rest on beats 1 and 2, which is something we haven't seen so far this video. So if that left-hand note is the last beat, it would have to be beat 4. That just leaves beat 3 to account for, where I might notice both hands have a rest. The left hand has only a quarter rest on beat 3, but the half rest above tells me that the right hand is resting on both beats 3 and 4. With practice, I can spot all of that very quickly, but even if I'm able to understand the rhythm in time, I may or may not be able to play it in time. In theory, I should be able to play the rhythm correctly as long as I can keep a steady pulse. If I can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, without speeding up or slowing down, I already have the capacity to play the rhythm. But even without playing a single note, just keeping that steady pulse going does drain some of my mental resources. Depending on how strong my sense of rhythm is, it may be something I can do more or less without thinking about it, or it may require a larger portion of my concentration. I think of it as kind of like a computer program that's always running in the background. Most of the time, there should be computing power left to deal with other tasks, such as reading notes, but the more programs I'm running at once, the thinner those resources are spread. This slows things down, and in some cases, everything just crashes. To keep the computer analogy, in this example, there are some pretty taxing programs all competing at once for my brain's processing power. I'm trying to keep the steady pulse going, but I'm also trying to read the notes. The right hand is playing this A, which is probably a pretty familiar note for most pianists, but the left hand is much harder to read, so figuring that out is going to be a major drain on my resources. The rhythm itself is also not trivial. Even if I've gone to the trouble of solving the math problems, so to speak, if the rhythm isn't crystal clear in my mind, I could find myself thinking things like, wait a minute, why am I playing on beats 2 and 4, but not 3? Am I sure I'm doing this right? Those sort of thoughts are like a computer virus that isn't doing anything productive and is only slowing down my hardware. If I'm sight reading this, I'll do the best I can, and hopefully I won't make any mistakes. But if I have even a minute to spend practicing it, I'm going to spend that time trying to eliminate as many of those distracting thoughts as I can, and making all the programs run as efficiently as possible. Let's tackle them one at a time. I mentioned that reading the left-hand note is much harder than reading the right-hand notes, so the first thing I might do is just check what that note is. Even if I don't recognize it on sight, if I know how to read notes in the bass clef, I can count down from a note that I do know and work out that it's an A. More specifically, it's the lowest A on the piano. This is nice because it actually gives me 2 really easy ways to remember that note, either as the same note that the right hand is playing, A up here, A down here, or just as the very lowest note on the piano. Either way, once I've worked that out, I don't really have to read the note anymore. I just remember what it is and try to understand why the composer chose that note. In this case, I'm the composer, if you can call it that, and I can tell you I chose that note because it's the same note the right hand is playing, but much lower, and because it's the lowest key on the keyboard. So there you have it. The next program I might try to make more efficient is the program for reading the rhythm. Once I've considered all the details and I know I'm reading it correctly, I can continue to think about the fact that I'm playing on beats 1, 2, and 4, or I can actually invert that and think of playing all the beats except number 3. It's usually easier to play a rhythm that doesn't have any rests in it at all, so thinking of it as all but beat 3 might help to draw my attention to the most rhythmically difficult part of this example, which I think is just remembering to count the rest on beat 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now let's tackle the virus, or distracting thoughts that are causing me to second guess my reading. I mentioned before that I like to solve all 3 math problems for each rhythm: the right hand, the left hand, and the composite rhythm. And this is partly why. the more multifaceted my understanding of a piece of music, the easier it is for me to calm those anxious thoughts when they arise. If I intentionally track down and solve things that I know might throw me off when I'm practicing, it's easier to avoid them when I'm performing. I think I'll end this one here. If you've been watching the series so far, thanks for following. I've been enjoying making the videos and I have many more planned. I'm still experimenting a bit with how I can best present this material, and I recognize that this video may seem a bit more rambling or abstract than my last few. Let me know if you prefer this style or if you'd rather I make more videos on concrete topics.